of being co-chair with this steering committee for Alcohol Action Plan. And I co-chair this with Dr. Janice Fitzgerald as well, our Chief Medical Officer of Health for the Department of Health and Community Services. She's actually going to be joining us a little bit late too because she has a conflict, but certainly we'll be glad to have her when she joins. So we'll get started, and I just want to acknowledge that we have a combination of working group members in attendance here. Obviously our steering committee for the Alcohol Action Plan. I'm not sure, I can't see all the list of participants now because I have a couple of things open on my screen, but we've invited the Indigenous Health Team as well as the Advisory Council and the Recovery Council. So we have a number of folks joining today. And as Debbie mentioned earlier, we are recording the presentation, and then after the presentation, before we start the Q&A, we'll stop recording. Okay, so I'll turn it over to you, Debbie, to introduce our speakers.
Okay, thank you.
You've already done that, but when I attended late, I'm sorry if you already did that.
No, we didn't do that. We didn't do
Okay.
that. So today we're very delighted to have two of the researchers from the CAPE, the Canadian Alcohol Policy Evaluation Project, joining us to do a jurisdictional review of our work. And to talk in general too, I guess, about the CAPE project and the wonderful work that's happening there. So Cara Thompson works with St. Francis of Xavier University, and she's been involved in, I think, all three CAPE reports, Cara, and I have the pleasure to work on a Atlantic Canada working group with her as well. So Cara can probably provide a little bit added introduction. And Tim is the research director for the Canadian Institute on Substance Use Research, and who has the lead, of course, for the CAPE project. So thank you both. We also have Tina Price, who's behind the scenes here, but always a pleasure and always very helpful, who will be supporting us as well. So thank you both for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation and having the opportunity to ask you some questions as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie, for the introduction. I really appreciate it. Can everyone hear me okay? Tina, can we, is the audio okay? I'll just assume it is.
Sounds good on this end. Thank you.
Linda, thank you. Okay. So, yeah, so I think we can jump to the next slide. And in terms of where we are, our land acknowledgement, there's a little not very visible yellow circle down at the bottom at the tip of Vancouver Island. And that circle is where UVic stands. And so we want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands. And the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And it's really important to acknowledge this, particularly about when we talk about alcohol and other substance use, but since it's disproportionately impacted Indigenous peoples in Canada. And people can feel free to put their own territorial acknowledgements from where they are in the chat if they would like to do so. Next slide, please. So I'm a relative newbie to CAPE. I came to CSER as director about 2.5 years ago. But since we've been working on this project, we want to really acknowledge we've gotten a lot of support from a lot of different people, including Health Canada, the Public Health Agency of Canada. And then we've got a lot of in-kind funding and support from our co-investigators and their institutions, various knowledge users, and government stakeholders who have helped validate this thing. And I just wanted to also emphasize that the views and opinions expressed in this event are those of the CAPE project team and do not necessarily represent those of our funders. Next slide, please, Tina, thanks. So in terms of the outline today, we're going to try to save a lot of time for discussion at the end, but we're going to give you an overview, a CAPE overview and rationale, and then talk a little bit about policy domains. We're going to focus mainly on the Newfoundland and Labrador results and our recommendations for select policy domains. These are the policy domains that we're going to be focusing on today: pricing and taxation, physical availability, marketing and advertising controls, and monitoring and reporting. And as some of you know, there's 11 different domains in CAPE, but don't worry, at the end, we make a bunch of other recommendations for those 4 not covered in as great detail as these ones. Next slide, please. So I think a number of you are already familiar with CAPE, but what does CAPE offer? It offers accessible, evidence-based, up-to-date information for policymakers, researchers, non-governmental organizations, the public, etc. And we try to do a systematic policy comparison between Canadian jurisdictions over time. It's not really designed for trending, but we've done 3 versions, as was mentioned before. Number 3 is that CAPE is a platform for informing the public about effective alcohol policies, because a lot of times it's not people's top of mind. 4, CAPE is a mechanism for keeping public health approach to alcohol policy on the government agendas. And 5 is we also, in this CAPE 3, have a national community of practice that has more than 350 members. And that is to facilitate learning exchange and knowledge exchange and to keep networking on alcohol and alcohol policy, since that's so critical. Next slide, please. So why does CAPE matter? So what we're going to talk about quickly here is consumption, harms, and costs in Newfoundland and Labrador in 2020. So this slide is not part of the CAPE project, but really it serves as the motivation or the rationale for why we do CAPE in the first place, since effective public policies are the best way to reduce harms. So in terms of alcohol consumption on the left, people in Newfoundland and Labrador consume the equivalent of 540 standard drinks per person, age 15 and older. That includes among non-drinkers. So I believe that's over the average in Canada. Alcohol led to, or I should say caused 351 deaths, 1,900 or so years of productive life loss, and 24,000 hospital admissions in 2020. That's the most recent year for which data are available. And then, we often hear, because a lot of the opposition to policies comes from this idea that, like selling and consuming alcohol is so critical for the economy. But, we like to kind of shine the light on what really happens. Like if you look at alcohol's revenues for Newfoundland and Labrador, it amounts to 296 million or so. That again is in 2020 and 20 and 21 on average between those 2 years, versus the economic costs are actually larger than that figure, so 351 million. And so we have a net deficit paid by the government, essentially, or owned by the government, i.e. the taxpayers, of $54 million annually. So it's key to know that currently the costs in Newfoundland and Labrador exceed the revenues. Next slide, please. Well, let's get in under the hood a little bit more here. This shows more about the alcohol deficit, what we like to call the alcohol deficit. And Adam Shirk, I should mention, he's one of our scientists here at CSER. He is also on this webinar today, and he's, I know, working with you guys on your provincial alcohol action plan. He's a member of that, but he loves the alcohol deficit, as do I. So shout out to Adam. But when you divide that $54 million deficit that within the red bar, second from the bottom, among the total number of standard drinks of ethanol sold each year, you come out with a deficit of 22 cents. We're going to come back to this because the sale of most consumer goods does not cost taxpayers additional money. And it's one of the reasons for raising taxes on alcohol in comparison to other products. It's not just to reduce harms, but it's also to help close this deficit so that taxpayers, including people who don't drink or don't drink much, end up footing the bill for the alcohol industry and for heavy drinkers. Next slide, please. Well, this is I don't even know what you call these slides. It's like a nice mashup, but it's kind of showing different headlines about the general trends and policy directions across Canada since CAPE 2.0. I was in the US at the time of CAPE 2.0, and I can tell you that the general trends are very similar. The WHO recommended tightening alcohol regulations during the pandemic. However, the opposite generally happened in many developed countries, not all, but and in particular, there were a lot of policies that were put in place to ease the accessibility of alcohol. And as Tim Stockwell, my colleague and Adam's colleague, likes to say, you know, we like the idea of cheap, available products, but when we have alcohol that's too cheap and too available, we all end up paying a price for that. So we've seen, you know, in general, the expansion of alcohol sales into grocery and convenience stores, more online and home delivery options, oftentimes extended trading hours, home delivery permitted by third parties like Uber Eats. Why does that matter? It's because they don't have an alcohol license to have on the line when they deliver to someone and, you know, fail to do age verification, for example. Anyways, we do have some positive trends, including, you know, for example, Newfoundland and Labrador's action plan. But in general, we know that since COVID, there's been the alcohol industry has gotten about 20 years of requests, particularly with regard to increasing the availability of alcohol. Next slide, please. Well, the CAPE methodological process, I think some of you are familiar with it. I'm going to keep it high level. The first thing that we do is develop a scoring rubric. So we select those policy domains and then what we call the indicators within each domain. And then we recognize that some of those policy domains and the indicators within them they shouldn't all be weighted equal. So we go through this process to figure out how they should be weighted. And then we develop indicator scoring, and then we send it out for external peer review to make sure that they agree that, okay, you've got most of the major policies covered and you're weighting about, you know, their importance seems about right. And then we apply the scoring rubric to actual policy data that's collected mostly from various statutes, and then it's validated. And we really appreciate all the work from our government validators. And then we score it up and tabulate the scores and come out with the CAPE scores. And there's a lot of detail on the website if you're interested in the methods, because it's actually pretty important. Next slide, please. As a brief reminder, these are the policy domains. These are, in other words, the big categories that we look at: pricing and taxation, physical availability, control systems. Those are really important. That has to do with, like, you know, the monopoly and also just that in general, how governance around alcohol policies occurs in a province or territory. Impaired driving, marketing and advertising, which is a WHO best buy, but is difficult in countries with, you know, democratic countries where you're allowed to have commercial free speech, or relatively. Minimum legal age, health and safety messaging, liquor law enforcement, screening and treatment, alcohol strategy, and monitoring and reporting. The 4 with stars are the ones we're going to be focusing on today. Next slide, please. Well, this slide shows the CAPE scores by province and territory. The average CAPE score across all the provinces was 37%, with the highest score of 44%. That was in Manitoba. Newfoundland and Labrador was 41%, so in the middle. These scores, I'm just going to take a step back and say these scores are pretty tough. We think they're fair. Compared to last time, most people's scores went down. That represents, I think, mostly real or largely real policy erosion, but also represents the fact that we introduced some new policies that were a bit that were not widely implemented. Next slide, please. But if we want to think about a kind of a different way to score it, the scores we just presented reflect the performance of each province and territory according to what we consider the best practices according to the CAPE team. So these are pretty tough standards. But we also analyzed the policy data to see what score could be achieved by any jurisdiction if they were to implement all the best or near best practices that are currently in place somewhere across Canada. So it means they are doable, for sure they're doable, at least somewhere in Canada. So this is not the best practices judged by the CAPE team, but in comparison to our provincial and territorial peers. And we called this scale the, quote, best existing policies score, which I think is better than the clunky name. But the point is that if, for example, Newfoundland and Labrador implemented all of these policies, the best ones that exist somewhere in Canada, then the score would be an 80% or an A-. So there is lots of room and practical room for, hopefully for improvement. Next slide. So this slide shows the results by domain. The treatment indicators, by the way, measure the existence of services only, but not their quantity or quality. So these are the overall scores. Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at those 4 domains that mentioned with the stars earlier. I'm going to talk about pricing and taxation, and then Kara Thompson will talk about physical availability, marketing and advertising controls, and also monitoring and reporting. And hopefully we'll have a good amount of time left at the end for discussion and compare what you hear today with your own thoughts behind your action plan. Next slide, please. Pricing and taxation. So this one shows the pricing and taxation domain scores. In other words, there's an overall CAPE score, but within each of these domains, we also give a score. And this one shows what the domain scores for pricing and taxation on a province and territory specific basis. And here we see that the average score for pricing and taxation was 29%, and that Newfoundland and Labrador got a 39%. So a bit better than average, but we'll get into some of the specifics now. Next slide. All right, so this is looking at some of the indicator scores by province and territory. So these are some of the components, in other words, that go into this pricing domain score. So we're going to walk through this kind of slowly. So first of all, we have that blue bar on the left. You can look inside the red triangle there, the stand-up triangle. So this is related to minimum pricing policies for off-premise establishments. Off-premise meaning like places where you go to purchase alcohol, but you consume it off-site. So that would be like liquor stores and grocery stores, that sort of thing. That's important because off-premise, that's where about 80 to 90% of all the alcohol is sold in off-premise locations as opposed to on-premise locations like restaurants and bars. So if we want to see a province or territory doing better in off-premise versus on-premise, we would pretty much choose their off-premise practices because that's where most of the alcohol is going. And then, so for minimum prices, for the off-premise, we looked at whether those prices apply to all beverage types, beer, wine, spirits, etc., whether or not they are indexed to inflation, so i.e. do they adjust automatically, and whether prices are based on the ethanol content as opposed to just the volume of the beverage. And then the orange line, which is the next one over to the right, is the minimum pricing thing for on-premise locations, restaurants, bars, and pubs and clubs. And those have exactly the same criteria as I just mentioned for off-premise. For the general pricing, and that's the gray bar, we look at whether prices are keeping pace with inflation or not by examining differences between the average consumer price index and the general price levels for the last reporting year for alcohol. Now, this one is kind of tough because you can say, well, prices don't necessarily have a ton to do with government policies, and yet they do to the extent, or you can make that change by having product-specific taxes for alcohol, which could make up the fact that alcohol is becoming more affordable relative to other goods and services across Canada. The last bar, that mustard yellow one on the far right, is looking at taxes and markups. And here the point is that the key thing is that we're looking at to see whether alcohol is taxed higher than other consumer goods. Next slide, please. So in terms of those 4 bars, in terms of minimum pricing for off-premise consumption, Newfoundland and Labrador has minimum prices in place for all alcohol sold, which is wonderful, and has some of the highest off-premise minimum prices in Canada. That's also awesome. The off-premise minimum prices are indexed to inflation, which is great, but not automatically. And but they are only tied to the ethanol content for high-strength beer. For the other ones, they're not tied to the ethanol content. In terms of the orange, the minimum prices, Newfoundland is one of the provinces with the lowest on-premise minimum prices in the country. So while your off-premise minimum prices are relatively high, which is great, the on-premise, bar restaurant minimum prices are quite low, which is not good for public health. And it's not, those on-premise minimum prices are not indexed to inflation, nor tied to ethanol content. And as we mentioned, the gray, the general alcohol prices are not keeping up with inflation in Newfoundland and Labrador. And the key one for even though it's at the end, is again, those alcohol taxes and markups, that alcohol is not taxed at a higher rate relative to other consumer goods, as it is in many other provinces and territories where there are additional alcohol-specific taxes. Next slide, please. This is just a quick slide showing the minimum pricing. The off-premise minimum prices are the actual ones are shown on the left with the recommended. And as you can see, again, we're set a pretty high bar, and you guys are Newfoundland and Labrador is coming close to meeting that, but not so with the on-premise minimum prices, where the actual minimum prices are quite a bit lower than the Cape recommended ones. Next slide, please. So in terms of our key recommendations, is to base minimum prices for all alcohol on ethanol content, set minimum prices at recommended levels, index minimum prices to inflation. And again, this last one that is so critical is because overall you are doing reasonably well with your minimum tax stuff, but is to tax alcohol at a higher rate than other consumer goods by introducing an alcohol-specific tax. That would, again, is probably the most evidence-based of all the policies in terms of reducing harms, and would also go a long way to eliminating your alcohol deficit. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, sorry. Now I'm going to pass it over to Kara Thompson, who's gonna take over for the next 3 policies.
Great. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to speak to the remaining policies that we're going to cover today. So first is physical availability. And so when we're talking about physical availability, we're referring to the number as well as the density of licensed establishments and the hours of operation. And you can see that the average score across the jurisdictions was 40%, but Newfoundland scores the lowest at 30%. So well below the average in this domain. So when we are speaking to physical availability, there's a few things that we're looking for. So if we look at the blue bar, this represents whether there are provincial or territorial mandated limits on off-premise outlet density. So this might be limits based on population or just the number of outlets. We also look at outlet placement. So for example, is there a mandated minimum distance from schools and community centers, for example? We look at the density cap, which was defined as 2 or fewer per 10,000 capita age 15 plus. So this includes, when we're talking about outlet density, we're including private, government run, and firm and on-premise outlets. That's all included in that density limit. And then in hours of operation, we're looking at whether alcohol sales are mandated and how they compare to the ideal, which for off-premise is not before 11 a.m. and not beyond 8 p.m. and fewer than 7 days per week. So that's that makes up your score in the blue bar. Now the orange bar includes the same as above with a few differences. So the orange bars are on-premise density. So this is our restaurants and bars. The density cap's different for on-premise. So the recommendation is 15 licensed establishments or fewer per 10,000 capita age 15 plus. And the hours are also different. So the recommendation is hours of sale don't extend beyond 1 a.m. the following day, and that there aren't exceptions to or extensions of hours that are granted for special occasions, for example. The gray bar, which you can see Newfoundland has done quite well in, is representative take home and takeout and home delivery. So we know that takeout and home delivery increases both the temporal and spatial availability of alcohol, particularly for minors. And so in this, we're looking at whether there are regulations prohibiting home delivery of alcohol for on and off-premise establishments, or requiring that home delivery be provided only by the retailer and not a third-party licensee, and that there's a requirement of a food purchase with the delivery. So I'll speak to what your findings were next. So if we go back to the blue bar, we're looking at density, placement, and hours of sale for off-premise, or our liquor stores. The level of population-based off-premise outlet density in Newfoundland is nearly 10 times higher than the recommended 2 outlets per 10,000 capita. So there's a lot of availability and access to alcohol at off-premise establishments. Now, Newfoundland does have legislative powers to set population-based outlet density and placement, so where these businesses can be placed, but there's none currently in place. So the capacity is there to do it, but they're not currently being implemented. For hours of sale, they're not set in legislation, but they are pretty close to the recommended of hours of 11 a.m. to 8 p.m. fewer than 7 days a week. So they're close, but they're not set in legislation. So that's the recommendation there. With the orange bars, we're talking about the on-premise again. So the level, a little bit better, but the population-based density for on-premise in Newfoundland is 2 times higher than recommended. The recommendation is 15 outlets per 10,000 capita. Again, Newfoundland does have the power to legislate where it can be placed and put limits on them, but not currently in place. And hours of sale, again, pretty close to recommendations, but not set in legislation. So kind of very similar policies for on and off premise in terms of areas for improvement. Now, obviously, Newfoundland does the best in this domain in terms of takeout and home delivery. So in Newfoundland, the high score is really reflective of the fact that you don't allow home delivery from off-premise alcohol. Okay, so liquor stores are not allowed to deliver. Now, on-premise alcohol takeout and delivery is permitted in Newfoundland, but there is a very clearly defined food component that's set in regulation, and so that also helps your score along in this domain. So if we look at the key recommendations for physical availability overall, it's to focus on setting population-based outlet density and also consider where these are being placed relative to kind of vulnerable populations, to reduce and legislate maximum trading hours as recommended, and prohibit alcohol takeout and delivery, including by third parties, so from on-premise establishments. So this is not allowing third-party delivery services like Uber Eats or DoorDash to deliver your alcohol, because it makes it much more difficult to ensure that they're complying with alcohol policies like checking for ID and that type of thing. So if Newfoundland was to implement the best existing policies that are currently in place across Canada, their score could increase from 40% to 82%. So there's lots of great examples of where these things are being done that you can look to for assistance. All right, so the next one I'm going to talk about, I know Debbie and I have talked about this before, a big fat 0 there for Newfoundland, unfortunately, but we're hoping that's going to change here. You see it in the action plan, so that's good. So in this domain, you can see there's a lot of variability. If you can go, yeah, thank you. The average score is 33%. There's a lot of variability across jurisdictions with regards to this, but we know alcohol marketing is not only one of the most cost effective, but it's also one of the most effective areas of policy for reducing alcohol harm. And right now in Newfoundland, there are very few, in fact, no policies in place that restrict or enforce advertising and marketing. So this, if you can go to the next slide, if you like. So I'll speak to what are the types of things we would look for to change for the next time. And I'm sure you guys have had some conversations around this before. But when we're talking about alcohol marketing and advertising, we're essentially talking about two things. One is what are the restrictions? And then the other is how are you enforcing the restrictions that you've put in place? So when we're talking about the types of restrictions that we're looking for, we talk about volume of advertisements. So is there a limit on quantity or amount of advertising that's allowed? It's recommended to ban price promotions. And also, again, consider the placement of those ads. So there's some jurisdictions that restrict where ads can be placed. So for example, not near schools. And the effectiveness is focused on making sure that their policies apply to all different forms of advertising. So social media, broadcast, print, but also all advertisers. So all the different groups that are advertising. And also important to have an independent body that has the authority to monitor and enforce these restrictions. So those are the types of things that we're looking for in this domain. So our key recommendations are to implement some of these restrictions on quantity, content, placement, price-based promotions across all advertisements and media types, and to appoint an independent health-focused enforcement authority. So we're recommending pre-screening, mandatory pre-screening of alcohol ads, as well as hosting a online complaint system to so that consumers can complain about violations of these. And then also having escalating penalties that commensurate with the violations. So marketing and advertising, we can only go up from 0. So I'm sure there'll be lots of improvements next time. All right. So the last one I'm going to speak to is monitoring and reporting. And the average here is 63%. And we know monitoring and reporting is a really important component of any comprehensive approach to reducing alcohol harm. So it includes things like routine, comprehensive monitoring of changes in consumption, drinking patterns, harms over time. And we also want to track policy implementation and policy actions over time, which is part of what CAPE is doing, so that we can assess what is most effective. So you can see Newfoundland scores 54%. So not doing too bad, but still below the national average. So what we're looking for in this domain, if you look at the blue bar, we're talking about how comprehensive is the monitoring. So is there systematic tracking of alcohol-related indicators? So we're looking for per capita alcohol use, drinking patterns, wholly and partially alcohol-attributed hospitalizations and deaths, crimes, costs, and alcohol policy changes. So those are the types of things we're asking, recommending to be monitored. So that's the blue bar. Transparency is measured by the orange. So this is whether their results of the specific alcohol-related indicators are made publicly available and reported on annually. And then the gray bar is the knowledge translation activities, which is looking at whether there's like an online centralized public reporting platform or system, like a website, for example, that would have all the alcohol related indicators in one place, and whether there's a formalized leadership that's identified as the knowledge broker of this information, and whether there's production and release of government supported knowledge translation products. So those are the types of things that we're looking for here. So the blue bar, you score the highest in. So Newfoundland scores about a 73%, so a B in blue. So it has one of the lower scores compared to other provinces and territories, but it is still doing quite well. But one of the reasons it's lower is because it's only partially tracking in some areas. So for example, it tracks alcohol consumption, but not drinking patterns. It tracks wholly, but not partially attributable alcohol-related hospitalizations. So not a difficult fix to kind of add a few indicators to what's already being done, but the score could be easily increased there. Orange, Newfoundland does publicly report on some indicators, like DUIs, for example, but not all indicators. And then the gray, we score the lowest because there's no centralized public reporting system. Newfoundland has an identified knowledge broker, though, that's accountable for public reporting. So there's points awarded for that. So the key recommendations: implement systematic and comprehensive tracking of all alcohol indicators, as I said, and also report annually the indicators through some sort of centralized system. So I'm just going to sum up kind of what's really being done well, and then just a few recommendations from the domains that we didn't cover in detail today, and then we'll open it for questions. So what is Newfoundland doing really well? They have the highest, among the highest off-premise minimum prices in Canada. So a really important and effective policy that's in place. There are some restrictions on alcohol takeout and delivery, and which we hope will stay in place. We've seen a lot of loosening of delivery restrictions across the country with COVID. So these are really important and strong policies that we'd like to see stay. The trading hours are also near the recommended limits, so that's also really great. Many policies that you do have meet or come close to the recommendations. So in areas of like impaired driving, you're really close to the recommendations. Liquor law enforcement, very close. Screening and treatment interventions, as Tim said, you score really high in that domain, but it measures existence and not quantity or quality of the treatment services. And then you also have this beautiful, fully funded, endorsed standalone alcohol action plan, which you were awarded for and actually had a huge impact on your ranking. So I know Tim showed all the scores, but you guys had the biggest change in your ranking. You moved from 11th place last time to 3rd place this time. So where everyone else was going the other direction, you guys have really improved your score from last time. So I think that deserves a round of applause for sure. All right, so just a few last recommendations in areas we didn't cover. So the control system, as Tim mentioned, we're talking about kind of government owned versus privately owned stores and who oversees the control of alcohol. So the recommendation for control system for Newfoundland is to appoint a health and safety focused ministry to oversee alcohol regulation and distribution, including a public health and safety explicit mandate is important, and also trying to increase the proportion of government owned versus government owned and operated off-premise retail outlets. So the proportion is quite small at the moment, which is, we're seeing that trend generally across the country. But those are recommendations for that. Minimum legal drinking age, require proof of age verification. So the 2-stage for remote sales, enhance health and safety messages. We're talking about implementing alcohol labeling as a manufacturer requirement, and mandatory on-site health and safety messaging in all premises. And then the action plan, consider greater alignment with the CAPE recommendations for existing action plan areas and add policy areas that are not yet included. So those are recommendations for that. And I just want to acknowledge once again that the provincial alcohol action plan is really wonderful, and it's so great to see, and so thankful that CAPE has been able to help guide this plan. And we're really excited to see as this gets implemented, what comes out of it. Yeah, we'll be following along to see what happens. So that's all I have. We can open it up for questions.